The story opens with a gesture of clinical intimacy that feels like a death sentence. Brielle leans over the bed, her warm brown skin a sharp contrast against the sterile white of the luxury suite, as she performs a routine pupil check on the supposedly vegetative Kang Jae-hoon. The audience hears her soft, professional murmur, "Just look at the light, Mr. Kang," a standard phrase for a man who hasn't blinked on his own in months. But as the penlight sweeps across his dark iris, the medical expectation is shattered. His pupils don't just react to the light, they constrict with a terrifying, conscious focus. Looking into his eyes isn't like looking into a void, it's like looking through a telescope at a predator who has been watching you from a distance for a long time. This is no longer a nurse caring for a patient, it is a woman realizing she is being hunted by a man who is supposed to be a ghost. The audience is instantly gripped by the chilling realization, if the silent king is actually awake, who is he waiting to kill? The introduction solidifies the psychological trap by contrasting Brielle's blunt, weary defiance with the heavy, calculated stillness of the room. Brielle is established not as a submissive caregiver, but as a woman pushed to her absolute limit, her medical scrubs creased from a life of fighting a corrupt system. The environment amplifies the tension, a high-tech hospital suite overlooking a neon-soaked skyline, smelling of ozone and expensive linens, where the only sound is the rhythmic, lying beep of a heart monitor. As Brielle works, her lost filter begins to show. She speaks to his motionless form with a blistering, cursed honesty, mocking the supposed weakness of the man whose broad shoulders and muscular torso strain against his silk hospital gown. She notices tiny, impossible details, the way his heart rate stabilizes perfectly when his enemies enter the room, and the way his muscle density feels like a coiled spring rather than atrophied tissue. The introduction ends at the peak of this intimate siege, Brielle leaning in close to deliver a final biting insult to his silent face, unaware that the hand resting calmly on the sheet is about to snap around her throat to claim its only ally. The transition from the public hospital to the Kang estate's private medical wing had felt like a promotion, but as the clock struck midnight on her first official shift, Brielle realized she had simply traded a crowded battlefield for a gilded cage. The luxury suite was an architectural marvel of glass and chrome, perched high above the Seoul skyline, yet the atmosphere was suffocating. Every surface was too clean, every corner too sharp. Beneath the scent of expensive sandalwood and the soft hum of life support machinery, there was a sterile, pressurized silence that made the hair on her arms stand up. Brielle moved through the room with the practiced efficiency of a woman used to chaos, but here her footsteps were swallowed by the plush carpets. She adjusted the monitor settings, her eyes tracking the steady green line of Kang Jae-hoon's heart rate. On paper, he was a billionaire in a state of suspended animation, a king waiting for a miracle. In person, he was a masterpiece of controlled stillness. His broad shoulders filled the bed, and his chest moved with a slow, heavy cadence that felt less like a coma and more like a predator holding its breath. As she reached for the IV stand, her sleeve caught on the edge of the bedside table, and she paused. Her eyes drifted to the walls. They weren't just decorated with fine art, they were embedded with discreet, high-definition lenses. Small red status lights blinked from the smoke detectors in the vents. This wasn't just a hospital room, it was a high-tech observation deck. Every movement she made, every adjustment of his sheets, and every whispered word was being recorded by an invisible audience. "You aren't a patient," she murmured, her voice barely a thread of sound in the cavernous room. "You're a prisoner." She looked back at Jae-hoon. His face was a mask of marble, his jet-black hair immaculately styled even in his supposed slumber. He looked too perfect, too disciplined. Brielle felt a surge of the old defiance that had cost her her last job, the urge to scream into the silence just to see who would flinch. She knew the type of men who lived in rooms like this. They didn't just have doctors, they had handlers. They didn't have nurses, they had witnesses. She checked the door, noting the heavy electronic deadbolt that only opened from the outside via a biometric scanner. She had been told it was for his protection, to keep the vultures of the corporate world at bay. But as she looked at the reinforced glass and the lack of a manual override, the truth settled in her gut like lead. If an assassin walked through that door, she was the human shield. If the building caught fire, she was the collateral damage. She leaned over him, her shadow falling across his chiseled jawline. The IV drip ticked like a countdown. For a moment, the green line on the monitor spiked, a sharp, jagged mountain in a sea of flat plains, before smoothing out into a perfect, lying rhythm. Brielle didn't move. She stared into his closed eyes, sensing the immense, coiled energy beneath his skin. The night shift wasn't about medicine. It was about surviving the gravity of a man who was faking his own death, trapped in a room built to ensure he never woke up. The stillness of the 3 a.m. hour was shattered not by a sound, but by a presence. Brielle was adjusting the dosage on the primary infusion pump when the biometric lock on the suite's double doors hissed open. A man in a lab coat she didn't recognize, a specialist with a face as sharp and sterile as a scalpel, strode into the room. He didn't check the chart, he didn't look at the monitors. He moved directly toward Kang Jae-hoon's central line with the mechanical focus of an executioner. "Dr. Eris is on rotation tonight," Brielle said, her voice cutting through the hum of the room like a blade. The stranger didn't flinch. He reached into his pocket and produced a pre-loaded syringe, the liquid inside a sickly, viscous amber. "New protocol," he replied, his tone clipped and devoid of empathy. "The chairman ordered a neuro booster to stabilize the late-night tremors." Brielle's eyes darted to the syringe, then to the man's hands. He wasn't wearing gloves. A specialist wouldn't forget gloves. As he reached for the injection port, Brielle stepped into his path, her body a small but immovable barricade between the needle and Jae-hoon's chest. "I need to see the digital order," she said, her fists partially clenched, her jaw set. "And that's a high-concentrate potassium derivative, isn't it? That's not a booster. That's a cardiac arrest." The air in the room curdled. The man's expression shifted from professional indifference to a cold, murderous irritation. "Step aside, Nurse Carter. You're paid to monitor, not to question your superiors." "I'm paid to keep him alive," she hissed, leaning forward aggressively, her eyes burning with moral conviction. "And you're about to commit murder in a room full of cameras." The man gave a soft, chilling laugh, glancing up at the blinking red lights in the ceiling. "You think those are for your protection? The feed is looped, Brielle. In 5 minutes, the records will show a tragic, spontaneous heart failure, and you'll be the one explaining why you were too slow to start the crash cart." He lunged for the port. Brielle didn't think. She acted on instinct, grabbing his forearm and twisting with a strength born of years of handling heavy patients and heavier burdens. The syringe skittered across the floor, the amber liquid spraying onto the white linens. The specialist growled, shoving her back against the heart monitor. The machine shrieked in protest, a long, high-pitched alarm that should have brought security sprinting down the hall. But the hallway remained silent. The high-tech prison had gone dark. The hospital wasn't just compromised, it was the weapon. Brielle scrambled for the emergency call button, but the specialist caught her by the hair, dragging her away from the bed. "A whistleblower to the end," he sneered, "such a waste of a pretty face." He reached for a second vial in his pocket, but as he moved to strike, Brielle felt a change in the room's gravity. The rhythmic, lying beep of the heart monitor didn't just spike, it flattened into a low, predatory hum. She looked past the specialist's shoulder and froze. Jae-hoon's hand, which had rested like marble on the sheet for months, was no longer still. His fingers were curled into a white-knuckled fist, the veins in his muscular forearm bulging with a sudden, violent influx of blood. The silent king wasn't just watching anymore, he was waking up. The specialist scrambled to retreat, his eyes wide as he looked at the medical monitors, which were now screaming in a frantic, rhythmic pulse that signaled a body coming violently back to life. But the man was a coward. Seeing the twitch in Jae-hoon's hand, he fled the room, the heavy biometric door hissing shut and locking Brielle inside the silent tomb. The loop was still running. No security was coming. The silence that rushed back into the room was heavier than the threat of the needle, and for Brielle, it was the final, agonizing straw. She stood trembling by the bed, the adrenaline curdling into a dark, hot rage. She looked down at Kang Jae-hoon, at the broad, powerful chest that was now heaving with a suppressed strength, at the jawline that remained mockingly perfect, while her own life was falling into 1,000 jagged pieces. She had lost her job, her reputation, and nearly her life tonight, all for a man who sat in a throne of silk and pretended the world didn't exist. "You're a monster," she hissed, her voice cracking with the weight of her exhaustion. She stepped closer, invading his space, her shadow looming over him like a curse. "You sat there. You watched him. You watched that needle come for your heart, and you let me fight him alone. You let me risk everything while you played dead in your high-tech casket." You leaned down until her face was inches from his cold skin, her hot breath ghosting over him, her dark eyes burned with a moral conviction that had been sharpened into a weapon. "I hope you rot in this bed," she whispered, the words dripping with a bitter, jagged grief. "You aren't a king, you aren't even a man. You're a coward, Jae-hoon. You're a hollow, gilded shell of a man who was too afraid to face the enemies he made. You deserve the silence you've built around yourself." The monitor spiked, a sharp, angry mountain of green light, but she didn't stop. She was done obeying the fear. "Stay in your cage. Die in your sleep. It's easier than standing up, isn't it?" She turned to walk away, to find a way out of the prison that had become her workplace, but she didn't get a single step. A hand, thick-veined and radiating a heat that felt like a furnace, snapped shut around her wrist. The grip was not the weak, fumbling movement of a recovering patient. It was a vice. It was the strike of a predator that had finally decided to stop playing with its food. The force of it jerked her backward, her arm pinned against the mattress as she was forced to look down. Jae-hoon's eyes weren't just open, they were wide and burning with a dark, terrifying intelligence. The mask was gone, the silent king was gone. In his place was a man who looked like he had climbed out of hell just to pull her in with him. His grip tightened, his thumb pressing into the pulse point of her wrist, feeling the frantic rhythm of her terror. "You have a very loud mouth, Nurse Carter," he rasped, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. He didn't let go. Instead, he pulled her closer, his muscles uncoiling with a predatory grace that made the hospital bed look like a joke. "And you have no idea how long I've been waiting for someone to stop pitying me and start challenging me." The vibration of his voice traveled through the bone of her wrist, a low tectonic rumble that made the sterile air of the suite feel electric. Jae-hoon didn't just look awake, he looked revitalized by her fury, his dark eyes tracking the frantic pulse in her neck with the cold precision of a diamond cutter. Brielle tried to pull away, but his fingers were an iron shackle, anchoring her to the edge of the bed, where the silent king was rapidly becoming a nightmare in the flesh. "You've spent months whispering to a ghost, Nurse Carter," he rasped, his voice raw from disuse but carrying the serrated edge of absolute authority. Did you think I was deaf, or did you just enjoy the sound of your own defiance? Brielle's heart thundered. The moral conviction that had fueled her tirade was suddenly warring with a primal instinct to run. You let that man walk in here to kill you, she managed to choke out, her jaw set despite the tremor in her limbs. You let me almost die for a lie. Who are you? Jae-hoon pulled her closer, the sheer physical gravity of his broad-shouldered frame forcing her to lean over him. The scent of sandalwood and something sharper, the metallic tang of adrenaline, filled her senses. I am the man who has been counting the heartbeats of my enemies from this bed, he said, his gaze penetrating and devoid of mercy. And you are the woman who just blew my cover for a moment of self-righteous satisfaction. He sat up fully, the motion fluid and terrifyingly powerful. He didn't look like a patient, he looked like a god in a restrained throne, his white shirt unbuttoned to reveal a torso that spoke of violence, not frailty. He looked at the door, then back at her, his expression shifting into a cold, lethal calculation. The specialist who fled won't be the last, he said, his grip loosening just enough to let her blood flow, but not enough to let her go. The feed is looped for another 3 minutes. When that loop ends, the cameras will see you standing over a man who is no longer in a coma. My board will call it medical negligence, my enemies will call it a target, and they will erase you to get to me. He leaned in, his shadow engulfing her. You wanted the truth, Brielle. Here it is. I am orchestrating a war from this room, and you have just walked into the center of the kill box. I'm not a murderer, she whispered, her voice shaking. I'm a nurse. Then be a nurse to a dead man, he countered, his eyes flashing, because those are your only 2 paths. You can walk out that door as a witness, a loose thread that will be cut before you reach the elevator, or you can stay. You can be my hands and my eyes in the places I cannot go. You can help me burn down the men who stole your career and my life. He finally released her wrist, but the ghost of his heat remained burned into her skin. He held out his hand, palm up, not a plea, but a contract. The silence of the high-tech prison pressed in on them, the city lights outside mocking her with the illusion of safety. Choice is a luxury we both lost tonight, Jae-hoon said, his voice dropping to a seductive, dangerous whisper. Die as a witness, Brielle, or live as my accomplice. Which will it be? The biometric lock hissed with a finality that signaled the end of the loop. The silent king vanished as quickly as he had emerged, his body collapsing back into the bed with a precision that chilled Brielle's blood. By the time the heavy doors swung open to admit Director Park, the man who had been clawing at the edges of Jae-hoon's empire for months, the room was once again a sanctuary of sterile, motionless grief. Still no change, Nurse Carter? Park's voice was like gravel under a silk rug. He didn't wait for an answer, his expensive leather shoes clicking across the floor as he approached the bed. He smelled of cigars and triumph, a combination that made Brielle's stomach turn. Standard neurological response, Director, Brielle replied, her voice steady despite the adrenaline still screaming in her veins. She moved to the side of the bed, her warm brown hands reaching for Jae-hoon's arm to perform a routine range of motion exercise. It was a performance for the cameras, a clinical dance designed to hide the fact that she was touching a loaded weapon. As she lifted Jae-hoon's muscular forearm, the weight of it felt different. It wasn't the limp, heavy drag of a comatose patient. Beneath the skin, his muscles were humming with a suppressed, electric energy. As Park leaned over them, peering into Jae-hoon's face with a predatory hunger, Brielle felt a sharp, rhythmic pressure against the underside of her wrist. Jae-hoon was using his thumb, hidden from Park's view by the angle of her own hand, to tap a sequence against her pulse point. Dot, dash, dot. It was a code, a physical language burned into her skin. She realized with a jolt of terror that he was giving her instructions. While she feigned a standard stretch, his hidden strength was guiding her movements. He shifted his weight almost imperceptibly, his bicep tensing against her palm, forcing her hand toward the pocket of his silk hospital gown. "He looks smaller every time I see him," sneered Park, reaching out to mockingly pat Jaehoon's cheek. Brielle saw the monitor spike, a flash of green fury, and she immediately leaned forward, invading the space between them. "Please, Director, this sensory overload can be detrimental," she said, her eyes burning with a defiance that she disguised as professional concern. As she moved, she felt Jaehoon's fingers curl briefly around her own, a grounding, terrifying heat. He was signaling a direction. Left. She adjusted her stance, her body shielding the bed as she reached into the folds of the linens, her fingers brushing against a small, cold piece of hardware he had hidden there. It was a thumb drive, the size of a fingernail. The stakes were no longer theoretical. In the middle of this gothic corporate noir nightmare, she was no longer just a nurse, she was a smuggler for a ghost. She could feel the weight of Park's gaze on her back, the cameras recording her every breath. If she flinched, they both died. "Finish your rounds, nurse," Park muttered, turning toward the door, his interest already waning. "He's a dead man who forgot to stop breathing." As the door clicked shut, Brielle didn't move. She kept her hands on Jaehoon's arm, her heart thundering. The pressure against her wrist changed, a slow, lingering squeeze of recognition. He wasn't just a patient, and she wasn't just an accomplice. They were two predators in a cage, and the hunt had officially begun. The shadows in the room felt heavier tonight, pressing against the glass as a literal storm began to brew over the Seoul skyline. But the cold outside couldn't penetrate the heat radiating from the bed. Jaehoon's skin, usually like polished marble, was now a map of flushed, angry crimson. His breath came in ragged, shallow hitches that rattled against his ribs, and the heart monitor began to wail, a true, panicked siren that threatened to bring the corrupt night staff running. Brielle worked in a blur of motion, her own heart hammering a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had found the source, an abscess from a poorly managed IV site left by the specialist who had tried to kill him. It was a real infection, a high-grade fever that threatened to turn septic and shatter their carefully constructed illusion. If the hospital's head physician saw this, they wouldn't treat him. They would use it as the perfect excuse to let the vegetative billionaire finally slip away. "You have to stay still, Jaehoon," she whispered, her voice thick with an urgency that bordered on a plea. She moved to the medicine cabinet, moving her body with calculated precision to block the overhead camera's view. She had spent the last hour hacking the IV pump's display, mirroring a normal heart rate onto the central station's monitors, while the man in front of her was actually burning up. She returned to his side with a bowl of ice-cold water and high-dose antibiotics she had siphoned from the surgical floor. As she pressed a wet cloth to his forehead, he let out a low, guttural moan that wasn't calculated or predatory. It was the sound of a man in pain. His hand, usually a vise of iron, reached out and fumbled blindly until his fingers tangled in the fabric of her blue scrubs. He wasn't signaling a code or giving an order. He was clinging to her like a lifeline. "Brielle," he rasped, his eyes fluttering open, glazed with a terrifying glassy heat. The silent king was gone, replaced by someone raw and dangerously exposed. "Leave. If they find out, they'll bury you with me." "Shut up," she snapped, though her touch remained tender as she wiped the sweat from his neck. She leaned over him, her rich, warm brown complexion glowing in the soft light of the monitors. For the first time, she wasn't looking at him as a mafia boss or a paycheck. She was looking at the man beneath the scars. "I've already been buried by this system once, Jaehoon. I'm not letting them do it to you, too." He looked up at her, his jaw losing its predatory set for a single fleeting moment. In the silence of the high-tech prison, the power clash between them softened into something far more dangerous, a shared vulnerability. He watched her work, his gaze no longer a telescope but a mirror, reflecting a soul that had seen too much injustice and finally decided to fight back. As the fever finally began to break under her care, his grip on her wrist softened, his thumb tracing the curve of her palm in a slow, lingering gesture. There was no defiance in her now, only a quiet, burning resolve. She realized then that she wasn't just his accomplice in a shadow war. She was the only person in the world who knew that the monster in the bed had a heart that could still break. The hunt was still on, but tonight the tiger had finally found a place to rest. The storm that had been brewing over Seoul finally broke, lightning fracturing the sky and casting the luxury suite into jagged strobes of silver and shadow. The power didn't flicker, it died with a deliberate surgical finality. In the sudden vacuum of sound, the high-tech prison's red emergency lights failed to kick in, and Brielle knew instantly that the loop wasn't just running, it had been severed. The extraction had begun, but not by their allies. Brielle. Jae-hoon's voice was a low, steady anchor in the darkness. He was already sitting up, his broad shoulders silhouetted against the window's neon glow. The fever had left him lean and pale, his muscles still recovering from months of forced atrophy, but the predatory stillness remained. The freight elevator at the end of the North Hall, it's the only one on a separate grid. "You can't walk that far, Jae-hoon. Your blood pressure is still stabilizing," Brielle whispered, her hands already moving with clinical precision to disconnect his lines. She didn't use a flashlight, she used the rhythm of the room she had memorized. "I don't need to run, I just need you to be my eyes." He leaned on her, his heavy arm draping over her shoulders, his heat searing through her thin scrubs. He was a mountain of suppressed violence, but as they stepped into the pitch-black hallway, she felt the slight tremor in his frame. He was a king reclaiming his throne, but tonight he was a man who needed her strength to stand. The hallway was a labyrinth of shadows. Brielle led the way, her athletic build acting as his pillar. Her expressive eyes, now wide and alert, scanned the darkness for the telltale glint of a suppressed barrel or the tactical hum of a radio. They moved like a single organism, one body, two souls, bound by a midnight pact. Every few steps, Jae-hoon's grip on her shoulder tightened, a silent signal for her to pause. He couldn't see the enemies, but he could hear the shift in the air, the rhythmic tread of boots on linoleum. 2:00, he breathed into her ear, his scent of sandalwood and rain grounding her in the chaos. Behind the supply cart. Brielle didn't hesitate. She steered them into the recessed alcove of a janitor's closet, her back pressed against the cold wall, her body shielding his. A shadow swept past, a man in tactical gear, moving with the silence of a ghost. Brielle held her breath until her lungs burned, her jaw set in that characteristic defiance. She wasn't just a nurse anymore, she was the navigator through the underworld. When the path cleared, they moved again, a slow, agonizing crawl toward the north wing. Jae-hoon's breathing was becoming labored, his weight leaning more heavily into her. They reached the freight elevator, the dull gray doors a promise of temporary safety. Brielle jammed the call button, her eyes locked on the far end of the hall where a flashlight beam was beginning to sweep the walls. "Almost there," she whispered, her voice a fierce, urgent tether. As the doors hissed open, Jae-hoon pulled her inside, his back hitting the rear wall of the lift. He looked down at her, his dark eyes burning with a raw intensity that had nothing to do with the war outside. In the dark, cramped space, the underdog and the predator were equals. "You didn't leave," he rasped, his hand reaching out to cup her face, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her cheekbone. "I told you," Brielle said, her focused gaze meeting his. "I'm done obeying fear." The safe house was a concrete, brutalist structure hidden beneath the roar of the Han River's traffic, a stark departure from the clinical luxury of the hospital. Inside, the air tasted of salt and old machinery. Jae-hoon sat in a high-backed leather chair, his broad shoulders squared, a king reclaimed even in the shadows. He wasn't wearing medical silk anymore. He wore a black tactical shirt that strained against his powerful chest, the unbuttoned collar revealing a jagged scar across his collarbone, a permanent map of the day they tried to end him. "You think they wanted me dead for my money, Brielle," he said, his voice no longer a rasp, but a cold, resonant command. He gestured to a bank of encrypted monitors glowing in the corner. "The Kang board is just the face. The body belongs to the Dragonhead Syndicate. I didn't just build a corporation. I built a firewall against the underworld. When I fell, I didn't go into a coma. I went underground." Brielle stood before him, her blue scrubs stained with the sweat and oil of their escape, her sharp cheekbones highlighted by the flickering blue light of the screens. She looked at the data scrolling past, arms shipments, offshore accounts, names of men who appeared on the evening news as philanthropists. "You're a mafia boss," she stated, her focused gaze locking onto his. There was no judgment in her voice, only the flat realization of a woman who had seen the world's rot from the bottom up. "I am the man who keeps the monsters in their cages," Jae-hoon countered, his dark eyes steady. "And right now, the cage door is open. I need a ghost to close it, someone the syndicate hasn't flagged, someone they still think is just an underdog nurse caught in the crossfire." He handed her a modified satellite phone. "They've spent the last hour celebrating my death at the hospital. They're preparing to dump my shares and trigger a hostile takeover at the opening bell. This message," he pointed to a string of encrypted code on the screen, "will bypass their security and hit the public ledger. It's a proof of rife signal, but more than that, it's a digital kill switch for their shell companies." Brielle took the phone, her fingers brushing against his. The physical power clash between them was still there, but it had evolved into something tectonic. He was a predator in stillness, and she was the moral force that had finally decided to bite back. "If I press this, there's no going back for me, is there? I won't just be a whistleblower. I'll be the person who brought down the syndicate." "You'll be the person who saved the king," Jae-hoon corrected, his thumb tracing the pulse point on her wrist, a lingering echo of the night he first grabbed her. "And the king never forgets a debt." Brielle didn't hesitate, her jaw set, her eyes burning with a defiance sharpened into a weapon. She executed the command. Within seconds, the monitors began to bleed red. The stock prices for the Kang subsidiaries began a vertical collapse that signaled the beginning of the end for the men who had tried to bury them both. Jae-hoon watched the screen, a predatory smile touching his lips. The Shadow King was back, and with Brielle at his side, he was ready to burn the world down to keep her safe. The glass doors of the Kang Group's executive boardroom didn't just open, they were thrown wide open by a force that felt like a shift in the Earth's axis. Brielle walked 3 paces behind, her blue scrubs replaced by a sharp obsidian-colored suit, her eyes burning with a moral conviction that had finally found its target. The room was a shark tank of men in tailored silk, frozen in the act of signing away Jae-hoon's legacy. Then, the impossible happened. Jae-hoon didn't roll into the room, he walked. Each step was a heavy, deliberate strike against the marble floor, the sound of a king reclaiming a throne he had never truly left. The silent king was gone. In his place stood a man of broad shoulders and terrifying physical dominance, his black hair immaculately styled, his gaze a cold, dark telescope that dissected every traitor in his path. The board members dropped their pens, their faces draining of color, as if they were seeing a ghost who had learned to bleed. "The meeting is adjourned," Jae-hoon said, his voice a low, gravelly vibration that seemed to rattle very windows of the skyscraper. He didn't need to shout. The predatory stillness that had defined him in his sickbed had transformed into an active, lethal grace. One by one, he laid out the evidence Brielle had helped him secure, the digital kill switches, the proof of the syndicate's reach, and the names of the men who had ordered the poisoned needle. By the time he reached the head of the table, the police were already waiting in the lobby. The collapse was total. The enemies who had called him a hollow shell were led away in silver cuffs, leaving the room silent once more. But this time, the silence was clean. Jae-hoon turned away from the panoramic view of the city and looked at Brielle. She stood near the door, her jaw set, her fists no longer clenched. The underdog had found her bite, and the predator had found his anchor. He walked toward her, the distance between them closing until she had to tilt her head back to meet his steady, penetrating gaze. "They'll call this a miracle in the headlines tomorrow," he said, his voice dropping to that intimate, dangerous whisper that had first bound them together. He reached out, his thumb tracing the sharp line of her cheekbone, his touch no longer a signal or a shackle, but a promise. "They'll say I woke up because of medicine or luck." "And what will you tell them?" Brielle asked, her focused gaze never wavering. "I'll tell them the truth," Jae-hoon rasped, leaning down until his forehead rested against hers. The scent of sandalwood and old rain clung to him, a reminder of the darkness they had escaped. "Everyone else looked at me and saw a bank account, a victim, or a corpse. They saw the silent king and felt pity or greed. But you," a rare predatory smile touched his lips, one that reached his eyes for the first time. "You looked at me and saw a coward. You cursed me until I was too ashamed to keep hiding. You were the only one, Brielle, the only one who actually saw me." He took her hand, his fingers tangling with hers, as they turned to face the sunrise over Seoul. The war wasn't over, and the syndicate would eventually strike back. But as they stood together, the dragon and the whistleblower, the world finally felt like it belonged to them. The tiger wasn't just awake, he was finally home.